Imagine this. You've spent your whole life climbing a mountain, one grueling step after another, chasing success, love, identity, validation. You fight through childhood wounds, societal expectations, internalized voices telling you who to be and what to want. And just as you begin to glimpse what feels like a summit, maybe around age 40, you look up, only to realize you've scaled the wrong peak. The view is barren, the wind colder than expected. Something in your chest tightens. The life you built starts to feel like a costume. The smile you wear begins to crack, and then a whisper, faint but unmistakable. This isn't who I really am. You try to shrug it off. You've got responsibilities, a reputation, people who rely on the mask you've worn. But the whisper returns, louder this time, cutting through your distractions like a blade through fog. Then who are you really? It's an unsettling question, one that doesn't offer the comfort of easy answers. What if everything you've achieved, every label you've worn, every persona you've carefully constructed was never you? What if it was all rehearsal? Practice for a life that hasn't even begun yet. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, whose insights still echo through the corridors of modern psychology, once suggested something radical, that the first 40 years of life are not the real journey. They are merely a preparation, a crafting of the mask, a necessary illusion, and what lies beyond, past the halfway mark, is where the true work begins. But if that's the case, why does no one tell you this? Why does the world celebrate the first half as the pinnacle, career peaks, marriages, mortgages, milestones, while the second half is spoken of in hushed tones of decline, crisis, or midlife madness? Could it be that society fears what comes next? Not because it is lesser, but because it is too real? Because it threatens the fragile scaffolding of everything we've been taught to believe about identity, purpose, and worth? You see, Jung believed that the first part of life is about adaptation, fitting in, becoming someone who can function in the world. We become what our parents want us to be, what school trains us to be, what society applauds. We build the persona, a mask so convincing we begin to think it is us. But what happens when the mask no longer fits? What happens when the applause dies down and you're left alone in a quiet room with the echo of your own soul? Have you ever felt it? That subtle sense of unease, like the life you've worked so hard to build is somehow hollow? Like there's a missing piece and no promotion, no relationship, no amount of money can fill it? Maybe it shows up as a restlessness, a longing, a vague dissatisfaction you can't explain. You have what you thought you wanted, and yet something aches. That ache, Jung would say, is the soul knocking. Not gently, not politely, but urgently, demanding your attention. It is the signal that the second journey is beginning. A journey not of becoming someone, but of unbecoming everything you never truly were. But are you ready to listen? Ready to step off the well-paved road and into the wilderness of your own psyche? Because the second half of life asks something terrifying. To dismantle the self you spent decades constructing, and in that dismantling, to uncover something raw, something ancient, something real. What if your so-called midlife crisis isn't a breakdown, but a breakthrough? What if it's your soul's rebellion against a life lived in exile from your truth? And what if everything you've endured, the pain, the confusion, the disillusionment, was never punishment, but preparation? The signs are subtle at first. A job you once loved feels lifeless. Friendships you cherished begin to fade. You look in the mirror and see someone you don't recognize. It's terrifying, but it's also sacred, because the descent into this inner questioning is not the end. It's the threshold, the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole, and it cannot begin until the old self begins to crack. So the question hangs in the air, heavy and unavoidable. If everything up to now has been the prelude, then what is the real symphony? And are you willing to hear it, even if it means unlearning everything you thought was true? Because beyond the mask, beyond the noise, beyond the life you were taught to want, there is something waiting, something wild, something you. But to find it, you must first step into the silence where the persona dies and the soul begins to speak. From the moment you were born, the world began sculpting you. Your name was given, your gender assigned. Expectations pressed into your soft, forming psyche like fingerprints into clay. You learned to smile when praised, to shrink when scolded. Slowly, unconsciously, you built a self, a version of you that could survive, belong, and be loved. But it was not you. It was a construction, a vessel made to please the external world. Carl Jung called this the persona, a necessary mask worn to navigate the collective theater of society. Without it, we'd be unfiltered chaos. But with it, something precious is hidden, the authentic self, the one buried beneath layers of performance and protection. Jung did not condemn the persona. He understood its necessity. In fact, he saw the first half of life as devoted to its creation. The ego must be formed before it can be transcended. A house must exist before one can renovate it. But the problem arises when we forget it's a mask, when the adaptation becomes identification, when survival becomes substitution. You mistake the role for the soul, and the longer you wear it, the heavier it becomes. That weight? It's not aging. It's the soul suffocating under decades of pretense. But why does this happen to everyone? Why is there almost no escape from this psychological conditioning? To answer that, we must reach deeper, into the roots of society, philosophy, and the architecture of consciousness itself. Friedrich Nietzsche once warned that most people never live. They merely obey. He called this herd morality, a form of psychic imprisonment disguised as virtue. From a young age, you're taught what to value: success, productivity, beauty, control. You're told what emotions are acceptable, what dreams are reasonable, what fears to hide. Even your rebellion is commodified. Tattoos, fashion trends, curated nonconformity. So you mistake noise for identity, busyness for purpose, consumption for freedom. But behind the curtain, the same system remains intact. Don't ask the deeper questions. Don't look behind the mask. Keep playing the part. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer believed that life is suffering, not because it's cruel, but because of our relentless desire to control it. We chase what we believe will fulfill us: status, relationships, recognition, only to discover that every fulfilled desire births another. An endless cycle of grasping that never touches the soul. And herein lies the trap. If your identity is built upon chasing the world's approval, then who are you when the world turns away? When the applause fades and you're left with silence? That silence, Jung insisted, is not emptiness. It's the doorway to the unconscious. The first half of life is solar, outward-facing, achievement-driven. It's the ego's establishing itself in the world. But the second half is lunar, an inward descent into shadow, soul, and mystery. Yet modern society has no roadmap for this descent. We worship youth and discard age. We glorify beginnings and fear endings. The midlife transition is often pathologized as depression, crisis, instability. But what if it's none of those things? What if it's the soul initiating its long-awaited return? To understand this shift, Jung pointed to a process he called individuation. Not mere self-improvement or personal growth, but a radical confrontation with the unconscious. It's the lifelong quest to become who you truly are, not who you were told to be. And it begins, paradoxically, when the persona begins to fail. That moment of collapse, when the strategies no longer work, when the roles feel hollow, is not the end. It's the beginning. The psyche, tired of maintaining a false identity, begins its rebellion. And it speaks through dreams, anxiety, restlessness, longing, not to torment you, but to awaken you, to call you inward. Jean-Paul Sartre once said that existence precedes essence, that we are not born with meaning, we create it. But what if the soul disagrees? What if there is something deeper than choice? An inner blueprint, a destiny written in the language of archetypes and dreams? Jung believed the unconscious holds a deeper intelligence, that beneath your conditioned self lies a hidden wholeness. Fragmented, yes, but alive. And to retrieve it, you must face the parts of you you've buried. The shadow, the wounded child, the repressed rage, the denied desires. This is the true work of the second half. Not building more, but remembering more. Not becoming someone else, but becoming more of yourself. But why now? Why does this shift often occur around midlife? Viktor Frankl, survivor of the Holocaust and father of logotherapy, observed that man's deepest drive is not pleasure or power, but meaning. And meaning, he said, often arises in suffering. Midlife, with its subtle losses and existential questioning, becomes fertile ground for this search. It is when the distractions begin to lose their flavor, when time reveals its limits, when you start asking, not what do I want to do, but why am I here at all? This is not a crisis. It is a calling, a sacred initiation hidden in the language of confusion, a spiritual hunger wrapped in the appearance of fatigue. And the deeper question now begins to emerge. Not just, who am I? But who was I before the world told me who to be? And am I brave enough to find out? You wake up one morning and the world looks the same, but something inside you has shifted. The job you once poured your identity into feels like a performance. The conversations that used to excite you now feel scripted. Even your own reflection stares back like a stranger. Familiar features, unfamiliar soul. It's subtle at first. A sigh here, a hesitation there. You brush it off. Maybe you're just tired. But the feeling lingers, grows. What once felt like stability now feels like a trap. You begin to question the life you've built, not because it's broken, but because you're breaking out of it. And yet, you can't explain it. Everything appears fine on the outside, but inside, something sacred is unraveling, something that cannot be reversed. This is the silent crisis no one speaks of, not the flashy kind, with tears and theatrics. This one is quiet, inward, invisible to the untrained eye. It's the soul shedding everything that isn't true. But the world doesn't recognize this process. It calls it burnout, mood swings, a phase. So you try to fix it. You distract, you numb, you double down on the old strategies. But they don't work. Because the issue isn't outside, it's within. The self you built is no longer sufficient to hold the truth trying to emerge. And resisting it only deepens the pain. Jung warned that if we do not consciously confront the unconscious, it will rule our lives, and we will call it fate. That's the danger of ignoring this inner shift. When you fail to listen to the soul, it speaks louder through crisis, illness, failed relationships, spiritual numbness, not as punishment, but as a summons. Every unhealed wound begins to surface. Every false identity starts to crumble. This is the shadow, the repressed, denied parts of yourself, returning for integration, not to destroy you, but to make you whole. But wholeness is messy. It requires undoing the neat boxes you've packed your soul into. It means facing the parts of yourself you've spent decades avoiding. Modern life leaves little room for this kind of inner reckoning. Our culture is addicted to forward motion, to progress, to achievement. We're taught to produce, optimize, hustle. But the soul doesn't move in straight lines. It spirals, it retreats, it descends into darkness before it rises. And if you try to bypass this descent, you forfeit the wisdom it offers. Aldous Huxley once wrote that most human beings have an almost infinite capacity for taking things for granted. We take our roles, our routines, our beliefs as truths, never questioning their origins. But when the soul awakens, it dismantles those illusions. It forces you to see the scaffolding, to question the script. And that can be terrifying. You may find yourself grieving, not just for lost time or lost dreams, but for a version of you that never really existed. You mourn the person you were supposed to be, the life you were conditioned to want, the dream that was never really yours. And in that grief, a strange freedom emerges. You begin to realize that the breakdown is not a failure. It's a release, a cleansing, a burning down of the false to make room for the real. But that truth doesn't come easy. It demands everything. Your ego, your attachments, your illusions. This is the price of awakening, and most people are too afraid to pay it. But there are consequences for staying asleep, for clinging to the persona. You begin to live a ghost life, a shadow of yourself. Your passion dims. Your relationships become transactional. Your body carries the weight of unexpressed truth. Jung believed that unlived life doesn't disappear. It festers in the unconscious, erupting later as neurosis, depression, or dis-ease. You think you're avoiding discomfort, but you're really postponing your own aliveness, because there is no bypassing the soul's call. You can only delay it. And the longer you wait, the more disruptive its return becomes. We live in a world that celebrates construction. Build more, earn more, become more. But what if real growth begins with deconstruction? What if the true journey is not forward, but inward? Not becoming someone new, but unearthing the one you've always been beneath the rubble of conditioning? The unseen consequence of a life built on adaptation is this. You may succeed by the world's standards and still feel hollow. You may have everything, yet feel like nothing, because the persona was never meant to fulfill you. It was only meant to protect you until you were strong enough to live without it. So here you are, the old life cracking, the new life unclear, suspended between two selves, one fading, one forming. It is not a comfortable place, but it is a holy one, because this is the space where transformation begins, where illusions die and authenticity is born. But will you embrace it? Will you descend into the shadows, not to escape, but to retrieve your soul? Or will you go back to sleep, hoping the ache will pass? The choice is yours. But know this, the longer you ignore what is stirring inside you, the more relentless it becomes. Because what's calling you is not just purpose. It's truth, and truth will not be silenced forever. You try to return to the life you once knew, but something inside refuses. The routines still function. The roles still fit on the surface. But within, it feels like wearing a costume stitched together by someone else. Conversations begin to feel like echoes, not exchanges. Achievements, once intoxicating, now taste hollow. There's an emptiness that success can't fill. And slowly, the terrifying question arises. What if I built my entire life on the wrong foundation? Not because you were foolish, but because you were unconscious. You did what everyone does. You played the game you were handed. And now, for the first time, you see it for what it is. A performance you never auditioned for. This is the cost of waking up. You lose the comfort of illusion. You begin to see how your deepest beliefs about love, worth, purpose were never truly yours. They were inherited from parents who projected their fears, from schools that rewarded obedience, from cultures that punished authenticity. You didn't choose this life. It was chosen for you. And the more you see, the more the world begins to lose its spell. Billboards scream promises that no longer move you. Conversations feel rehearsed. Social media, once hypnotic, becomes absurd. You're no longer seduced by what everyone is chasing. Not because you've transcended it, but because you've seen through it. Cognitive science tells us the brain filters reality. It selects what fits the narrative you've been conditioned to believe. So if you've spent your life believing that your value comes from achievement, your mind will filter out any evidence to the contrary. But when that narrative collapses, your perception shifts. You start noticing what you once ignored. The stillness between moments, the ache behind the laughter, the silent yearning in your own chest. You begin to feel again, after years of emotional anesthesia. But that flood of feeling isn't always joy. Often it's grief, regret, a longing you can't name. Because you're not just awakening to who you are. You're awakening to what you lost along the way. You see how you've dimmed your light to avoid rejection. How you've silenced your truth to keep the peace. How your relationships were built on roles, not realness. The unseen consequence of all this adaptation is a soul that has been whispering beneath the noise, begging to be heard. And now, those whispers are no longer soft. They are screams. You feel it in your chest, the tightness, the disconnection, the quiet despair that no one talks about. It's not a mental illness. It's not burnout. It's not a random phase. It is your inner self demanding resurrection. Neurologically, this moment is profound. Studies in adult development show that midlife, often seen as a plateau, is actually a neurological threshold. A point where the brain becomes more open to integration, introspection, and spiritual inquiry. The frontal lobes, responsible for reasoning and reflection, mature fully around this time. You are quite literally wired for transformation now in a way you weren't before. But only if you choose to listen, yet most don't. They numb, they distract, they buy louder toys, they chase younger lovers. They try to resurrect the self they once were, instead of becoming the self they were meant to be. Jung called this avoidance, spiritual stagnation, a soul arrested in development, doomed to repeat patterns it never understood. And those patterns don't just vanish, they metastasize. They become anxiety, addiction, restlessness. You think you're managing stress, but you're really managing suppressed truth. Culturally, we have no language for this sacred discontent. We call it a midlife crisis and mock it with sports cars and bad decisions, But what if the crisis isn't failure, but initiation? What if the unraveling is not a collapse, but a clearing? In ancient traditions, the midpoint of life was revered. It marked the time when the outer journey turned inward, when the warrior became the mystic, the provider became the seeker. The ego, once essential, was invited to sit down so the soul could speak. But we've lost those rights. In their place, we're offered distractions, shiny, endless, meaningless. And the tragedy? Most people accept them, not because they're weak, but because they're afraid. Afraid of what they'll find if they go inward. Afraid of the buried memories, the denied rage, the unlived dreams, the inner wildness they were taught to tame. But here's the truth. What you fear the most holds your freedom. What you avoid the longest contains your power. And until you face it, you will always feel split between the life you show the world and the one screaming beneath your skin. There is no awakening without disruption, no transformation without descent. You must go down to rise. You must let die what no longer serves, even if it once saved you. This is not self-help. This is self-initiation. It is the breaking of a spell, the rememberings of something ancient, something real, and the longer you delay it, the louder the soul will knock. Because this isn't just about you, it's about the world. A world in desperate need of awakened souls who've walked through the fire and emerged whole. You are being invited, not into a breakdown, but into a breakthrough, not into madness, but into meaning. The question is no longer, why is this happening to me? The real question is, what is this moment trying to awaken within me? You may try to outrun the question. Many do. You may drown it in busyness, in productivity, in performance. You may even call it growth, reading more, achieving more, leveling up. But no matter how fast you move, the ache follows. Because the soul is not interested in your progress, it's interested in your truth. And truth will wait. It doesn't shout over the noise. It waits in the silence, in the stillness, in the moments you'd rather avoid. It waits in the gap between who you've become and who you really are. And this is the great paradox of our time. We have more knowledge than ever, more tools, more access to information, and yet we feel more lost, more disconnected, more fractured. The reason isn't lack of data, it's lack of depth. We live on the surface. Scroll, swipe, simulate. But we do not descend. We do not listen inwardly. We don't know how. Because no one ever taught us that beneath the noise of the world, there is another world, one that speaks in symbols, in dreams, in longings. A world Jung spent his life exploring. A world we've been trained to ignore. This world is the unconscious. And it holds everything we've hidden. Our traumas, our creativity, our wildness, our shame. It holds the parts of ourselves we disowned to survive. The child who was too sensitive. The artist who was too impractical. The lover who was too intense. We exiled them, thinking it was the price of belonging. But in doing so, we didn't just lose parts of ourselves. We lost access to our wholeness. Because the unconscious doesn't forget. It waits, and it leaks. In your anxieties, in your addictions, in the tension between the life you live and the life you know you're meant for. To Jung, this disconnection was the root of most suffering. Not external failure, but inner fragmentation. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not who your parents wanted, not who your culture rewarded, not even who your ego projected, but the authentic self, buried beneath layers of roles and masks. This process of becoming is what he called individuation, the integration of the conscious and unconscious into a unified whole self. But this process is not comfortable. It is not linear, and it does not begin until the old self begins to crack. That cracking, what we call crisis, is sacred. It is the soul's rebellion against the tyranny of the persona. The moment when the scaffolding collapses and you stand face to face with everything you've avoided. Your truth, your pain, your power. And in that confrontation, something shifts. You stop asking, what do I need to do? And start asking, who do I need to become? You begin to realize that no amount of external change will bring peace if the internal self remains fragmented. That no relationship, no career, no accolade can make you feel whole if you are still divided within. This is the unseen consequence of a life disconnected from its depths. You become a stranger to yourself. You look in the mirror and don't see a person. You see a performance. You feel the emptiness, but you don't know why. So you keep moving, keep pretending. Until one day, the pretending becomes unbearable. And when it does, you have two choices. Numb it further, or listen. Listen to the ache. The dreams, the questions, the strange pull towards something deeper, older, truer. But be warned, this listening will cost you. It will cost you your certainty, your comfort, your carefully curated identity. It will strip you down, not to punish, but to purify. To burn away what is false so that what is real can finally emerge. And what emerges is not a better version of you. It is the true you, untamed and whole. The you that existed before the world told you who to be. The you that remembers what you came here to do. And that you is worth everything. So now, you stand at the edge of something vast. Not a breakdown, not a crisis, but a threshold. You can keep walking the path you know, familiar, safe, expected. Or you can step into the unknown, into the wild terrain of your own soul. You can begin the descent, not to escape, but to remember. Because everything you've been searching for, peace, purpose, power, doesn't live out there. It lives within. But first, you must face what you've buried. You must meet your shadow. You must grieve the persona. You must unlearn what never belonged to you. And then, in the stillness, you will hear it. The voice beneath the noise. The truth beneath the role. The self beneath the mask. And in that moment, you will not be reborn. You will remember that you were never asleep. You were only dreaming someone else's dream. And now, it's time to wake up. You wake up, and the world doesn't change. But you do. And because you do, the world begins to look different. Not through magic, but through perception, through presence. The veil begins to lift. You start to see people, not roles. Conversations become sacred exchanges, not transactions. Beauty returns to the mundane. A tree is no longer just a tree. It is a mirror, ancient and alive. Silence is no longer a void. It is the voice you've been longing to hear. You are no longer walking through life asleep. You are inhabiting it, fully, moment by moment. But this aliveness comes at a cost. You can no longer pretend you don't see. You can no longer participate in the collective sleep. And so, you begin the quiet rebellion. The rebellion doesn't begin with loud resistance. It begins with refusal. You refuse to betray your truth. You refuse to shrink to fit. You refuse to confuse productivity with purpose, performance with presence, noise with meaning. And this refusal ripples outward. You speak differently. You move slower. You listen deeper. You stop seeking approval from the very systems that once imprisoned you. You become dangerous to the status quo because you are no longer controlled by it. Carl Jung understood this rebellion intimately. He knew that individuation wasn't about becoming better. It was about becoming whole. And wholeness isn't perfection. It's integration. It's saying yes to your light and your darkness, your wisdom and your wounds, your knowing and your not knowing. It is the radical act of embracing the totality of who you are, not to fix it, but to embody it. Because when you do, something miraculous happens. You stop looking for salvation. You stop outsourcing your power. You begin to live, not from your conditioning, but from your center. The center isn't loud. It doesn't advertise itself. It's quiet, grounded, rooted. It doesn't react. It responds. It doesn't control. It creates. And the more you align with it, the less the world owns you. You are no longer seduced by false promises or manipulated by fear. You become sovereign, not in theory, but in being. You begin to remember that you were never meant to live a scripted life. You were meant to author it. This is what the second half of life is for. Not for decline, not for settling, but for deepening, for turning inward and uncovering the hidden treasures you abandoned to survive. Jung believed that the first half of life is for building the ego, necessary, functional, but ultimately incomplete. The second half is for transcending it, not destroying it, but liberating it from its illusions. And in that liberation, a new kind of self is born. Not a self built on image, but on essence. This essence cannot be taught. It must be lived. It must be excavated from beneath the rubble of shoulds and expectations. It must be nurtured in silence, in solitude, in the sacred in-between spaces of life. And when it begins to speak, you'll know. Not because it shouts, but because it resonates. It's the knowing you feel in your bones. The clarity that doesn't need to be explained. The direction that emerges, not from logic, but from alignment. You begin to make different choices. Not safer ones, truer ones. You say no to what no longer serves. You say yes to what once scared you. You follow the pull, even when it doesn't make sense. Because the map is no longer external. It is internal. You don't walk by sight. You walk by soul. And when you do, the world responds. Not always gently. Sometimes it will test you, strip you, challenge the very core of your being, but not to break you, to reveal you, to show you what cannot be taken, what is indestructible, what is eternal, because that's what this journey is about. Not self-improvement, not self-mastery, but self-remembrance, the remembering that you were never just a name, a title, a body. You are a mystery wrapped in flesh, a soul walking a sacred path. And the first 40 years, they were the preparation, the rehearsal, the building of the container. But now begins the descent, the return, the fire. You are no longer who you were, but you are not yet who you will become. You are in the alchemical middle, and here, everything that was hidden begins to rise. The wounds, the gifts, the questions, the truths. You are not being destroyed. You are being reformed. And the life that emerges from this process will not be louder, richer, or more admired. It will be real, and for the first time, that will be enough. You are not late. You are not broken. You are right on time. The soul does not run on the clock of the world. It wakes when it is ready. And when it wakes, the false must fall. The masks must burn. And what remains is the one thing you've been seeking all along. You. So you continue, not upward, but inward. Not toward the heights of achievement, but into the depths of selfhood. This is the turning point the world calls a midlife crisis, but that's a lie. Crisis is merely how the ego interprets the soul's awakening. It feels like collapse, but it is birth. It looks like chaos, but it is alignment. The life you built, the structure, the persona, the mask, it starts to crumble, not because you failed, but because it's finished. It did what it was meant to do. It held you until you were strong enough to let it go. And now you begin to see, not with your eyes, but with your being. You see that every false identity you wore was a shell meant to crack. That every role you played was a chapter, not a definition. You see that your suffering was not a punishment, but a portal. And the pain you spent decades avoiding, it becomes the doorway. You don't run from it anymore. You walk straight into it. And on the other side, you find what the surface world never gave you: depth, wholeness, meaning. This is the process Carl Jung called individuation, and it is not for the faint of heart. It demands that you descend into your shadow, the part of you you were taught to reject. It is there that you find the lost fragments, the rage you were told to suppress, the dreams you abandoned to be accepted, the grief you numbed just to function. But within those shadows is gold, raw, radiant, alchemical. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This is the real work. Not spiritual bypassing, not endless positivity, but integration. Facing your darkness, not to fight it, but to reclaim it. And slowly, the fragments come home. The parts of you that lived in exile start to rejoin the whole. You feel yourself becoming more real, more honest, more alive. Not perfect, present. You stop performing. You stop hiding. You stop pretending to be who the world wants and start honoring who you are. And the strangest thing happens. People around you begin to shift. Some will be drawn closer, recognizing the truth you now embody. Others will recoil, threatened by the mirror you hold up. Let them go. Their place was in the life you've outgrown. Because this new path isn't about fitting in. It's about becoming free. Free from the need to be understood. Free from the hunger to be admired. Free from the illusion that worth must be earned. You do not need to be fixed. You need to be found. And that can only happen when you stop running from yourself. When you turn toward the very places that hurt and say, "I'm here. I'm listening." And then something extraordinary happens. You begin to trust yourself. Not the mind, not the performance, but the quiet knowing beneath it all. You start making decisions that don't make sense on paper, but feel aligned. You start saying yes to what nourishes your soul, and no to what drains it, even if others don't understand. You begin to notice beauty again, in the curve of a leaf, in the breath between words, in the silence of a sunset. You become porous to life, sensitive, yes, but also strong in a way that can't be explained. Because you are no longer living from your wounds. You are living from your essence, and that essence cannot be taken. Not by failure, not by aging, not by loss. It is the one thing that has always been there. Beneath the striving, beneath the shame, waiting. It is not your ego. It is not your job. It is not your name. It is the flame behind your eyes, the breath behind your breath, the sacred that lives within the ordinary. And once you taste it, you can't go back. You may still play roles, still move through the world, but you do so with a different awareness. You are no longer chasing. You are no longer proving. You are simply being, And that is the most powerful thing a human can do. Because in being, you become a mirror that reflects not who people think they are, but who they truly are. You become medicine. You become invitation. You become reminder. You are not here to be anyone else. You are here to remember who you are. And in doing so, you give others permission to do the same. This is the silent revolution. The rebellion that needs no banners, no slogans, just presence, just truth, just soul. And it begins when you finally stop asking what the world wants from you and start asking what your soul is trying to say through you. And in that question, what is my soul trying to say through me? Something ancient stirs. It is not a voice that speaks in words. It is older than language, deeper than logic. It rises in the quiet moments between distractions, in the stillness after you stop pretending. It is not loud. It does not compete. That's why you've missed it for so long. Because it never shouted above the noise. It waited beneath it, patient, eternal. Watching you wear mask after mask, hoping one day you would lay them down and remember the one thing this world taught you to forget. That you are not a machine, not a brand, not a product of your resume. You are a soul, and the soul does not care about success. It cares about truth. You begin to see how much of your life was spent constructing a version of yourself the world could applaud, polished, productive, polite. But somewhere along the way, the applause began to feel hollow, because it was never for the real you. It was for the performance. And now, the performance is over. Not with bitterness, not with regret, but with reverence. Because it carried you here. It gave you the tools, the armor, the scaffolding. But now, the scaffolding must fall so the soul can rise. This is the final stage Jung spoke of. Not transcendence in the sky, but embodiment in this earth. To bring your soul into your body, your truth into your choices, your essence into the everyday. You realize that enlightenment isn't about escaping life. It's about entering it so fully, so honestly, that everything becomes sacred. Your morning coffee, your aching grief, your unanswered questions. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is meaningless. Everything belongs. And then comes the silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence. You no longer need to explain yourself. You no longer need to be understood. You simply are, and that is enough. You can walk into a room without needing to dominate it. You can meet another's eyes without wearing a mask. You can hold contradiction without collapsing, because you are no longer fragmented. You are whole, and wholeness doesn't mean perfection. It means nothing is exiled. The child in you is welcome. The rebel in you is welcome. The mystic, the skeptic, the lover, the warrior, all welcome. You stop editing yourself. You stop performing healing and start living it. Not as a goal, but as a way of being. Because healing isn't a destination. It's a return, a remembering, a homecoming to the self that was never broken, only buried. You see now that the crises of midlife weren't signs of failure. They were invitations, initiations, sacred ruptures designed not to punish you, but to awaken you. Because the soul doesn't want comfort, it wants truth. And truth, while often disruptive, is always liberating. It strips away the illusions, the identities, the false narratives, until only one thing remains, your essence, untouched by time, unchanged by praise or blame, whole, holy, and waiting. This is the treasure Jung called the self. Not the small self of the ego, but the capital S self that existed before the world taught you who to be. It cannot be found through striving. It cannot be earned. It can only be uncovered. And the moment you touch it, even once, you understand. This is who I've always been. Before the wounds, before the roles, before the world. And when you live from that place, life no longer happens to you. It moves through you. You become a vessel, a witness, a participant in the great unfolding. The need to control fades. The fear of the unknown dissolves because you trust the deeper current. You trust yourself. And that trust becomes your compass. Not logic, not approval, but resonance. The felt sense of alignment. The quiet yes that moves through your bones when something is true. And so you walk, not faster, but freer. You create, not to impress, but to express. You love, not to be completed, but to expand. And life meets you there, not with ease, but with meaning. Every loss becomes a doorway. Every ending becomes a beginning. Even death becomes less of a threat and more of a return. Because the real tragedy was never dying. It was never living. Living fully, living honestly, living with your soul at the center, not the margins. And now that you've begun, you can't go back. Not because you shouldn't, but because there's nothing left for you there. The old life served its purpose. But this is the real journey. Not away from the world, but into it. With eyes open, with heart open, with soul awake. And now, here you are. No longer seeking a beginning, because you've realized you are the beginning. Every step you take from this moment forward is not a search for meaning, but an expression of it. You've stopped waiting for the world to offer you permission, because you understand that you are the authority of your own existence. That what you were taught to fear, uncertainty, solitude, change, are not threats, but teachers. And perhaps the most beautiful paradox of all is this. The more you let go of who you thought you needed to be, the more fully you become who you've always been. There is no arrival, no final destination where everything falls into place. There is only this deepening, this slow, steady, sacred descent into presence. And from this place, you realize that purpose was never something to be found. It was something to be lived. Not as a grand mission, but as a quiet knowing. A devotion to what is real, to what is yours. Not what pleases others, not what garners praise, but what makes your soul vibrate. Maybe it's in your art. Maybe it's in your stillness. Maybe it's in how you hold space for another without needing to fix them. That is your revolution. That is your truth. And the world may not understand it. That's okay. You're not here to be understood. You're here to remember. To embody the mystery you were born with before you were taught to be afraid of it. To stop trying to be somebody and start allowing yourself to be alive. Fully, fiercely, without apology. Because the only real success is alignment. The only real wealth is presence. The only real power is authenticity. And once you taste that, everything else becomes background noise. You begin to see the sacred in the mundane, the divine in the imperfect. You start to trust the rhythms of your body, the language of your dreams, the silence that speaks louder than words. You stop outsourcing your wisdom and start listening within. And in that listening, you realize you are no longer lost. You are no longer fragmented. You are home. Home is not a place. It is not a person. It is not a destination. Home is you, stripped of performance. You, unburdened by expectation. You, rooted in your essence, aware that everything you need is already within you. And now that you've touched that truth, you carry it with you into every room, every conversation, every breath. You don't need to preach it. You are it. And your presence becomes the message. So if you've spent your first 40 years becoming what the world demanded, then know this. That was not a waste. It was the preparation, the apprenticeship, the soil in which the seed of your true self lay buried. And now, that seed breaks open, not because you pushed, but because the time has come. Because your soul, once whispered in the background, now sings in your bones. You are not broken, you are becoming. You are not behind, you are unfolding. You are not late, you are right on time. And this fierce, quiet, embodied truth is what the second half of life is for. Not more noise, not more chasing, but integration, wholeness, peace. The world doesn't need more perfect people. It needs more true ones. And you, right now, are the threshold. Not of a crisis, but of a return. Not to who you were, but to who you've always been. Beneath the noise, beneath the fear, beneath the striving. So take this breath. Feel it in your chest. You are here. And that is enough. That has always been enough.